Good morning, church. Good morning and welcome. I'm so glad all of you are here. Today we are continuing the series that Ronnie and I are in the middle of called Come and See. And today what I want to begin with is this idea that sometimes it's hard for us to see what we need to see when there's something that's in between. You ever experienced that? There's times when it's hard to see whatever it is we need to see when there's something that is in between. Just a few weeks ago, I was in my office sitting at my desk, and somebody came by and knocked at the door, and they said, "It's time." Well, that was April 8th, 2024. Maybe you remember that date. Maybe you remember that day. That was the day of the solar eclipse. So I grabbed these. Did you guys have a pair of these? Anybody keep theirs, for the next one? I don't know when that's going to be, but the last one was April 8th, and I grabbed my solar eclipse sunglasses. I walked downstairs and joined our staff. If you were in the Houston area that day, it was a bit of a cloudy day, kind of hard to see, but I was able to capture these pictures of the solar eclipse with my iPhone. I think they turned out pretty good. Just kidding, I didn't take those with my iPhone. I had a friend who left Houston and went to one of the areas where they were in the path of totality, and he told me, he was like, I really wasn't excited about it, but he's like, it was amazing. Like it was a sight to behold, this moment where the moon passes between the earth and the sun, and all of a sudden, even though it's the middle of the day, like you're in the middle of darkness. You can see that there's a ring of light. The sun is shining behind the moon, but at least for a moment, even though it should be the middle of the day, you feel like it's the middle of the night because you're standing in complete and total darkness. It's hard to see what we need to see when there's something in between. And right now, I don't think I'm breaking news by saying this, but there are a lot of people in the world. There may be a lot of people in this room for whom you're facing or you're up against or you're in the middle of some kind of darkness. And that can be for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes we find ourselves in the middle of a present darkness because of choices we made, because of things that we've done. And sometimes those were mistakes we didn't mean to, but other times, if we're honest, we knew what we were doing. And now we're dealing with the consequences of those actions or of those words or whatever it is that we have done. And we wish we could go back in time and change it, whatever it was, but we can't. And so now we're facing this present darkness. Sometimes it's because of things we did, but sometimes, you ever been here? Sometimes you're in the middle of some kind of darkness, and it wasn't because of anything you did. It was because of something someone else did. It was a decision they made that you maybe had nothing to do with, and yet now you're having to deal with the consequences of those actions, of those decisions. It was no fault of your own, but now you're feeling like you're having to face up and live in the middle of that darkness. Different reasons, but they all lead to the same place. They all lead to the path of totality. They all lead to darkness. And whenever you're in the middle of darkness, sometimes it's hard to know. Sometimes it's hard to see. If you were able to see the total eclipse, then you probably realized there was the ring of light around the moon. You could see the light of the sun shining behind the moon. There was a ring of light. And what I want to suggest today is that whatever darkness you're facing, and for whatever reason you're facing it, there is a ring of light. There is a ring of hope. And after all, isn't that what faith is? Faith is believing that there is light on the other side of the darkness. And I think that's what was happening in this story in John 4. If you have your Bibles, your scriptures, maybe you have the YouVersion Bible app, let me invite you this morning to open to John 4. All summer long, we're leaning into the Gospel of John. We want to come and see what it is that John wants us to see. Come and see what it is that Jesus wants us to see. And when we get to John chapter 4, we find ourselves in the middle of this beautiful story. And if by chance you've never read this story, you've never heard this story today, I'm a little bit jealous of you, right? Because sometimes we come to Scripture and we bring with it all the things we've been taught, all the things that we've thought, and so we have these preconceived ideas. Sometimes it's hard to read the story with fresh eyes. If you've never read the story, heard the story, I'm excited for you. If you've heard the story 1,000 times, if you grew up and you learned it at VBS way back in the day, I want to invite you, as best you're able, to come into the story with me, and let's try to read it anew. Let's try to read it afresh and hear the word of the Lord today as if we're hearing it for the first time, so that we can see what it is John, the author of this gospel story, wants us to see, so we can see what it is Jesus wants us to see. John chapter 4, verse 1, here's how the story begins. Jesus knew the Pharisees had heard that he was baptizing and making more disciples than John, though Jesus himself didn't baptize them, his disciples did. So he left Judea and returned to Galilee. He had to go through Samaria on the way. So the Pharisees, they see what's happening with Jesus, and they're not too keen on the idea that he's got a following right now. Jesus knows it's not really time to have a confrontation with these religious leaders, so he decides, hey, I'm going to go ahead and leave Judea and go to Galilee. And then John writes this. He says that Jesus had to go through Samaria. Now, I don't want to call Brother John a liar, but just look at this map. I mean, clearly, the shortest, the quickest way to get from Judea to Galilee is through Samaria. But it wasn't the only way. In fact, most Jews would actually leave Judea and they would cross the Jordan River and they would go up along the Jordan River and then cross back in front of the Sea of Galilee to get into Galilee. They wouldn't go through Samaria, and that's because they were trying to avoid Samaria and, if I'm being honest, avoid Samaritans. There was a deep divide between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people. Part of that goes back to hundreds of years before, when Israel was a divided nation. Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians. They were taken off into exile, but there were some that remained in the land. And they began to intermingle and intermarry with those Babylonians and with those Assyrians. And when the exiles finally returned to the land, these Jewish people came home. They saw what was happening, and they couldn't believe it. And these people who became known as the Samaritans, now they became known as the outcast. And for those reasons and so many more, there was a deep divide between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people. Most Jewish people, if they had to get from Judea back up to Galilee or vice versa, they're going to cross the Jordan River and take the long way. But John writes that Jesus had to go through Samaria. But maybe that wasn't because of a geographical reason. Maybe there was something else going on. The next verse, verse 5, John writes, eventually he, Jesus, came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired from the long walk, sat wearily beside the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please give me a drink." He was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. Well, now we know why Jesus had to go through Samaria. He had a meeting on his calendar that nobody else knew about but him. And he sits down beside this well, and John right here does a beautiful thing. He wants you to know that Jesus is fully God, but he also wants you to understand that Jesus is also fully human. He wants to invite you to see the humanity of Jesus, because after a long walk in the hot sun, Jesus is hot, he's tired, he's thirsty, he's weary, and he sits down beside this well, and what he really wants is a drink of water. And if you're reading this story some 2,000 years ago, if you're one of those first people who held the Gospel of John in your hands and you're reading this story literally for the first time, you realize there's something wrong about this story. First of all, it's noon, and nobody comes to draw water at noon. It was customary for the women to come and draw the water for the household. Normally, they would come in the early hours of the morning or right before sunset in the cooler parts of the day. Nobody comes at noon at the hottest part of the day. So you're asking the question, why is she coming at noon and why is she coming alone? And if you're asking that question, like I'm sure they asked that question, you're probably coming up with some ideas. Maybe you even have some preconceived ideas about why she's doing that. You may have heard that the reason she came at noon to draw water was because she was an immoral woman. And that's certainly a possibility. Interestingly, though, in this story, Jesus never addresses her sin. She never forgives her sin. She never tells this woman to go and sin no more, or anything like that. Things that Jesus normally does in that kind of situation, that doesn't happen in this story. And one thing I would invite you to think about, at least consider, is what if the reason that John tells us this woman has come at noon has really nothing to do with her sin at all, but something else that John wants us to see. It's hard to see what we need to see when there's something in between. And for a lot of us, including myself, I come into the story with some preconceived ideas. But if you back up just one chapter, we talked about this last week in John chapter 3. Jesus has this encounter with a man by the name of Nicodemus. He's a Jewish religious leader. He's a Pharisee, a respected rabbi. And Nicodemus, and he comes to meet with Jesus when he comes at night. And Nicodemus, in that story in John 3, initially, Nicodemus doesn't come to faith after meeting with Jesus at night. But one chapter later in John 4, you have the Samaritan woman who comes to Jesus when? In the light of day, the brightest part of the day, at noon. And spoiler alert, by the end of the story, she is actually going to come to faith. For John, this idea of light and dark, they play an important part in his gospel story. So what if the point that John's trying to make, what if Jesus wants us to see, what if the reason he's meeting with this Samaritan woman at noon has less to do with maybe a sin problem in her life, but everything to do what she is going to come to believe in the light of day? But there's another problem. Verse 9. The woman was surprised, for Jews refuse to have anything to do with Samaritans. She said to Jesus, "You are a Jew. I am a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" So just to state the obvious, Jesus is a Jew. Jesus is a man. Jewish is a respected teacher, a rabbi. This Samaritan woman is a Samaritan. She is a woman, and in her day, in her time, in her culture, she had the lowest possible social standing. The two of these should never be meeting. The two of these should never be alone. And if perchance they should ever find themselves together alone in the same place at the same time, they should never be talking. They should never be having any kind of interaction. It's hard to see what we need to see when there's something in between. But Jesus has already crossed one boundary, one border. He's come into Samaria, and now he's crossing another boundary. Did you notice that Jesus is the one in this story, who initiates the conversation? He starts the conversation with a Samaritan woman. He's crossing every boundary, every border, every obstacle imaginable. Why? Well, you remember what Jesus told Nicodemus, John 3, 16, 17. We read those verses just a moment ago in our time of communion together. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, so that everyone who comes to believe in him would not perish, but have everlasting, eternal, abundant life. And now, just a few verses later in John chapter 4, Jesus is demonstrating, Jesus is showing us what for God so loved the world actually looks like. Jesus comes to her, and he says to her in verse 10, if you only knew, if you only knew. If you only knew the gift that God has for you and who you are speaking to. If you only knew. You would ask me, and you know what I would do? I would give you living water. But sir, you don't got a rope. You ain't got a bucket. Like again, she's stuck in the moment, right? You don't have a rope, you don't have a bucket, and this well, it's very deep. Where would you get this living water? And besides, you think you're greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? How can you offer better water than he and his sons and his animals enjoyed? And Jesus replied, anyone who drinks this water, you know what's going to happen. They're going to get thirsty again. But those who drink the water that I give will never be thirsty again. It becomes like a fresh, bubbling spring within them, giving them eternal life. Well, that sounds pretty good. Please, sir, the woman said, give me this water, then I'll never be thirsty again, and I won't have to come here to get water. Now, you remember, again, when Jesus was talking to Nicodemus about being born again, Nicodemus thought Jesus literally meant physically being born again. He had no idea how that could be possible. And here in this moment, Jesus is talking with the Samaritan woman about living water. She thinks he's talking about literal physical water, not what Jesus is talking about. He's talking about something different entirely. He's talking about living water, water from a well that never runs dry, water that becomes a bubbling spring within you, water that gives not just physical life, but water that gives eternal life, abundant life. And watch this. She doesn't exactly understand what Jesus is offering here, but she wants it. And that may be where you are today. Like, you may not fully understand. You may not have all your questions answered. Hey, here's some good news today. You don't have to have it all figured out. If you want what Jesus has to offer, or maybe if you just want what Jesus has to offer, that's enough. That is enough. She doesn't fully understand it, but she wants it. And then this happens. And a little disclaimer, I think this is one of those moments where how you read, the tone of voice in which you read these next verses really can change how you hear these words from Jesus. And we don't know how he said it, but I can't help but think there was compassion in his voice. When Jesus looked at her and he said this, "Go and get your husband." "I don't have a husband," the woman replied. Jesus said, "You're right. You don't have a husband. For you've had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man that you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth. If you're anything like me, when you get to this part of the story, you probably think this is the sin problem that Jesus came to address. This is the reason that maybe this woman came at noon to draw water all by herself. She's had 5 husbands, and the man she's living with now isn't even her husband, and we don't really even know why. And again, is that a possibility? Absolutely. But I also want to invite you to think about this woman's cultural situation some 2,000 years ago. See, Jewish and Samaritan women, they didn't have the ability to initiate divorce. If a woman had 5 husbands, if she'd been married more than one time, it was probably because of 1 or 2, maybe more, different reasons. More than likely, one of the main reasons a man would divorce a woman, and divorce was certainly the first reason, is because the woman was unable to have a child because she was barren. There's a possibility that this might be the situation that this woman is in. Women back in that day and time, they had one job, to have kids. To not be able to have children, to be barren, that was an incredible burden to bear. And so you can imagine the shame that would bring upon her or any person in that situation. There's every possibility that the reason she came at noon is because she was bearing that burden, the weight of that shame, the weight of that embarrassment, all on her own. One of the reasons that she might have had more than one husband was because of divorce. The other reason was because of death. And according to Levirate law put in place, by the way, to protect women in vulnerable situation, in vulnerable culture, according to Levirate law, if your husband died, then you married his brother. And if he died, then you married his brother, and on down the line. And we don't know why, but there's every possibility that that this woman has either been divorced 5 times, or her husband has died, or some combination of those events, and she has no son to take care of her. None of those things would have been her fault, yet she finds herself in this vulnerable situation. Maybe she was a sinful woman, maybe she wasn't. No doubt she felt a little lost. No doubt she felt alone, abandoned, hopeless, helpless, hurt. And as soon as Jesus acknowledges her pain, as soon as she begins to tell her things about her life that he couldn't possibly know any other way except that he's a prophet of God, he is some kind of man from God, she very quickly shifts the conversation to questions about God, and even to questions about worship and questions about where to worship. These were important questions for her and for her people, but these were also important questions for the very first readers of John's gospel. More than likely, by the time this gospel was written and received, the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed. So one question everybody was asking is, where do we worship now? And how do we worship? So Jesus tells this woman, and John is communicating to his readers this in verse 23. Jesus says, the time is coming. You need to know this. Indeed, it's here now when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And after hearing this, the woman says, I know. I believe. I know Messiah is coming, the one who is called Christ. And I know that when he comes, he's going to explain everything to us. And then listen to what Jesus says next. And don't miss this. We're pretty early in the story. Jesus has yet to speak these words to anybody. In fact, she will be the first person to hear these words. The Samaritan, this woman who's had 5 husbands, the one she's currently living with right now is not her husband. This is the one to whom Jesus chooses to reveal his identity and speak these words. Jesus looks at her again. I believe he looked her in the eye with a heart full of compassion. He says, I am the Messiah. I'm the one. I'm the one you've been looking for. I'm the one you've been longing for. I'm the one you've been waiting for. Throughout John's gospel, 7 different times, he's going to make these I am statements to communicate to people a little bit more about who he is and what God is like. And he'll say things like, I am the light of the world, or I am the bread of life, or I am the good shepherd, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But right here, in this moment, before he says any of those things, Jesus communicates to this woman who he really is, his truest identity. And he says, I am the Messiah. I'm the one. And maybe, just maybe, if you've ever felt like there's something between you and God that would prevent him from coming to you, maybe this morning just take heart and know that he would love nothing more than to come to you and tell you who he is. That he is Messiah, he is Savior, he is God. Jesus wanted her to see in the light of day who he really is and the abundant life he brings. Well, when she heard this, verse 28, the woman left her water jar. She left everything beside the well, and she ran back to the village, telling everyone, and underlined these 3 words, come and see. Come and see. A man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah? So the people came streaming from the village to see him. Now, it's hard to see what we need to see when there's something that's in between, but right here in this moment, Jesus has removed the something in between for this woman to see him. He's removed her shame. He's removed every obstacle, every barrier. He's removed everything that would keep her from seeing who he really is. And so her eyes are open and she's able to see that this is Jesus, this is God's Messiah. And she goes back to her village to tell everyone who she has seen. And when she does that, what happens? Everyone from the village comes out to see him. Isn't that interesting? I think that's interesting. If she had been a notorious sinner, would her witness have carried any weight? What if the people in her town wanted to come and to see whoever it was she was talking about? But if the circumstances of her life had left her in a difficult position, maybe, just maybe, her witness carried a little more weight when she ran back to town and said, "You got to see the man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be God's Messiah? This person who met me at the well and declared over my life that I am seen and I am worthy of love, of connection, of belonging, of community, of relationship, of salvation." Jesus comes and he meets this woman at the well, and he lets her know that she will never be forsaken again. She will never be abandoned again. She will never be alone again. Why? Because God so loved the world, because God so loved you. That's why Jesus had to come through Samaria that day, so he could tell her that she's not alone, so he could remove her shame and invite her to step into the river of God, to allow that living water to come into her heart and into her life and overflow. And watch what happens next. Verse 39, many Samaritans, John writes, many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, "He told me everything I ever did." This woman and many in her town came and believed. They came to see who Jesus really is because of what she said about him. And I just wonder today, what is it for you? What would it take for you to come and see and believe? It's hard to see when there's something that's in between. So what is it that is between you and Jesus that makes it hard for you to see God? What is it that is between you and Jesus that for whatever reason makes it hard, makes it difficult for you to see God? On April 8th, when we were outside looking up at the sky, it was a cloudy day, but the clouds broke really just for a moment, and we were able to catch a glimpse of the eclipse. And here in this area, it wasn't necessarily a total eclipse because we weren't in the path of totality. What we saw was the eclipse, but you could still see a sliver of the sun. You could still see that the light was shining. And today, what I want you to know is that whatever darkness you're up against, whatever is between you and Jesus that makes it hard for you to see God, wherever you find yourself in that story today, there is a light that is shining. There is a ring of light. There is a ring of hope. And he has a name, and his name is Jesus. And what I would invite you today to come and see is to come and see the same thing this woman came to see. That Jesus will come. And he wants to meet you where you are. And he will meet you as you are. So you can believe just how loved you are by God. Jesus will come to you. And he wants to meet you as you are, where you are. Because he wants you to know just how loved you are by God. When this woman had this life-changing encounter with Jesus, she couldn't help but tell everyone she could find who he was and what he had done and how he had changed her life. And I think that's true for us as well. Whenever you have that kind of life-changing encounter with Jesus, it's hard. It's hard not to tell everyone who he is and what he's done and how your life has changed. And this morning, that's my prayer for you. That's my prayer for us as a church, that we could be those kinds of people, pointing people toward Jesus, pointing people towards the light of the world, pointing people to that light that's shining on the other side of the darkness.